Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
So what's new and exciting in your world this week, Ant?
I've been observing changes in the economy, little things that you see on a day-to-day basis. When I was a teenager, it first became the thing for stores to be open 24 hours. I got used to that, and now not so much. Things close down like they did when I was a kid, right? Even on Sundays, things will be closed that before COVID were open.
I remember back in the Blue Laws days of Connecticut, stores closed at 8 o'clock and they were closed on Sundays.
Yeah, there was nothing to get on Sundays. I needed to get my chimney swept in anticipation of the winter, so I called up, as I usually do this time of year, to make an appointment, figuring that going to be a week or 2 weeks out. And they say, oh no, the earliest we can get to you is mid-November.
Well, 3 years worth of pent-up demand, right?
Right. Well, yeah, it's that combined with the shortage of workers. You've got people working from home, the great resignation. I see story after story of people saying to their employers, no, I'm not going to do that. Whatever that is, I quit. All of this has me thinking. I've been to Spain a number of times, and I can recall looking at the place and thinking it's beautiful. The people there are wonderful. And yet, as an economist, I kind of shake my head and say, well, yeah, I can see why their per capita income is like 60% of what ours is, because shops aren't always open. People seem not to be working as hard as Americans do. And if you look at the numbers, interestingly, that kind of follows. World Bank maintains data on the number of hours that typical workers work in various countries. Topping the list is Mexico. The typical Mexican worker works 2,100 hours a year. That comes out to be 40 hours a week on average. And that's actual work. We're not counting lunch breaks and stuff like that. Typical American worker, 34 hours. Typical German worker, 1,350. The typical German worker's working 2 days less a week than the typical Mexican worker. Typical American worker's working 1 day less a week than typical Mexican worker. And this brings me around to this observation that I think in my armchair observations of Spain, I was premature. Looking at the thing saying per capita income could be much higher if your stores were open more and people were working more hours and this sort of thing. With the experience of COVID and what has followed, I'm wondering if countries like Spain have it right, that there really is no need to be open 24 hours. And okay, so I have to wait till November to get my chimney cleaned, but now that I know that, I'll call in March instead of calling in August. And so we just adjust to the new reality, and maybe at the end, with these adjustments, we end up pretty much just as well off as we were before, but with a lot less stress.
I see no way that would be possible. People choose to work longer and harder so they can make more money, and that's the goal of most people. If that's the goal of every person who goes off and has a job, right? But I do need money, and other people do too. Thus, we work the hours we work. If we were to decide to cut a third of the hours away, yes, in the immediate term, that would make me far happier. In the longer term, it would cause me all kinds of problems.
And yet Americans seem, in light of COVID and the lockdowns, to have somehow woken up and said, yeah, you know what? The balance that we had selected was too much toward work. It seems that across the country, people are wanting to work less.
And I see that with entry-level jobs all over the place. I don't see it with management and ownership. I see it in that one category, which is causing all manner of difficulty for managers and for owners. Now they have to deal with that. But we always say that about management and owners. Now they have to deal with that. And how they deal with that, well, now that's going to be the interesting part, right? What are they going to come up with that people will find sufficient? We live differently now than we did 3 years ago. What does it all look like in the end? I don't know.
I'm very interested to see what the U.S. business world looks like when today's 20-somethings end up in their 40s and 50s when they're in management. Do they revert to an outlook that today's managers have of, you have to be in here X number of hours doing this job? Or do they carry with them the lessons that they've learned? That, yeah, we can be more relaxed. You can work from home. We can be flexible.
It's going to be hilarious because they're going to say things like, back in my day, we worked 18 hours a week.
Right, yeah.
When I was a kid, you used to have to go to work. I disagree with you considerably, but on the central point, I think I agree with you quite a lot. There is a new kind of reality coming around the concept of work, and it's going to be really interesting what that turns out to be. From working at it, I want to take you to outer space. Michael Crichton wrote a book a long time ago, and I know you actually read sci-fi. Michael Crichton wrote a book called The Andromeda Strain. Did you ever read that one?
Yeah, I did years ago.
Some kind of pathogen makes its way to the world from outer space, and it just wipes out the human population. And now that we're getting these flights ready to go to Mars, people are saying things like, okay, hey, wait a minute. We might bring back a thing that causes global human extinction. Maybe it would be best if we make sure we don't bring back a global pathogen from the surface of Mars. And they're building a special lab in Utah, my former home, that will take in any stuff that is brought back, open it up, and make sure it's not going to kill us all.
Well, you remember they did that with the astronauts back in the days of the Apollo program.
And they didn't talk much about it either, right? We only learned about that years and years later. And you start to scratch your head for a second and say, well, yeah, that actually is a possibility. And maybe we should be a little more careful. That brings us to the foolishness of the week. And I'm not even going to ask if you know what it is this week because it's so arcane. Buried in a technology section of the Indian Express, augmented reality contact lenses could replace your phone screen.
Oh, yeah, I'm waiting for that, man. That's one step away from surgically implanted.
That's right. I know you're waiting for this and that you're also waiting for some kind of nonsense that goes right to your brain.
Oh, I want to be a Borg so bad.
What's wrong with you?
There's some interesting philosophical questions about reality. What is reality but something that impinges upon your nerves and then sends signals to the brain and we interpret? That's all this is doing. It's creating signals coming to the brain we're interpreting.
I get it. And yet this is somehow going to draw people out of their physical lives. We've been playing with that for a while now. We have been dragging people out of their physical lives in many different respects for quite some time. It's been, I think, a limited success. We're doing pretty well with that, but it's also been a limited failure. There are things that are lost that were really worth something. And I'm not the guy to point to the past and say we had it better back then and our neighborhoods were like communities. Well, of course they were. We didn't have any options. That's what we had. We met people at the mailbox when they came home from work. We're slowly but surely wedging a gap between us as human beings and reality as we've always known it to be. There are all kinds of bad things coming. How do I know that? Because you and I know what unintended consequences are.
We've given away 2 mugs over the past 2 weeks, and it's been a lot of fun. People send us lots of emails, and I want to give away another one.
How many emails have we gotten?
Typically, I get like maybe 30 emails a week just on the mug.
All right, so that's not many.
And there's always these hopeful people that send them in 3 days late.
Yeah, I kind of feel bad for them, too. These are really great mugs, I will say. But I'm guessing if we had a random thing, lots more people would join into the hunt.
Do you know off the top of your head how many ounces of tobacco you currently have in your humidor?
Not off my head, but as luck would have it, Ant, I've got a spreadsheet. It's a spreadsheet that you, of course, made for me. I have no idea how to make a spreadsheet.
So here's what we're going to do. And for people who aren't up on this, James...
It's got to be the Bob Barker way, though.
Oh, yeah, I understand.
The number. Yep.
I'll do that. But here's, for those of you that are unaware, James' humidor, and when I say humidor, do not picture a box that sits on your desk. James' humidor is the size of 2 refrigerators. In fact, it once was a refrigerator, one of those old-style ice boxes.
Let me stop you, because that humidor doesn't contain any pipe tobacco whatsoever. That's only for cigars. The pipe tobacco, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint here, takes up a china hutch, the top of a barrister's bookshelf, another section on top of my filing cabinets, and finally, it takes up an entire serving cart.
Good God.
Everything's in bottles.
And that's your loose tobacco.
That's right.
All right,
Ready
so we'll do your
apocalypse.
humidor another time when we talk about how many cigars you have.
I have no count whatsoever.
So the question is this. How many ounces of tobacco does James have?
Pipe tobacco.
Pipe tobacco. Person who comes closest without exceeding the number. That's ounces. Wins the mug.
And I will give you the hint that the last two numbers are 0.50.
0.5. Well, we're going to go down to half ounces here.
Oh, we go to, yeah, of course.
James takes his tobacco very, very seriously.
That's right. And I have guns all over the house pointing right near the tobacco in case anybody wants to steal it. This is a good one.
Send us that email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com. To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits. If you'd like to schedule us to come speak at your event, be it corporate or educational, or have James officiate at your wedding, send us an email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com. One of our listeners, Carson Collins, recently won third prize in the 2022 C-SPAN Student Cam competition for his video on the minimum wage. If you'd like to see Carson's prize-winning video, check out the show notes to this week's episode. This week's episode is an interview James and I gave for Dr. Anwar Dunbar on his YouTube channel, Big Discussions. See the show notes for a link to the Big Discussions channel and to the full interview. Also see the show notes for a link to Dr. Dunbar's Big Words blog site where he discusses education, financial literacy, and social issues.
Anthony, I want to discuss something you said, that the average American doesn't have the time, I'll add in the curiosity or the will to study the concepts that you and James talk about. Ultimately, this leads to doing things like voting strictly off of feelings and misinformation.
I see it all over the place. It's not specific to ages. You would think that it's a thing that's amongst young people. That's amongst young people, it's amongst old people, it's across the board. And the thing is this, on the one hand, the economy is a complex thing. You have to really think about carefully if you want to understand things like the impact of a minimum wage, or just today, the loan forgiveness that President Biden signed. And on the other hand, it's very easy to lie about the economy. If I'm a politician, I can get out there and say, hey, elect me and I'll forgive your student loans. And everybody cheers and they think that's a great thing. It's going to be wonderful. But it's not until you think about the ramifications of that you realize that actually that's not necessarily a good idea at all. It's certainly not as magnanimous as politicians would have you believe. And so we live in this very weird space when it comes to the economy, that politicians are able to disseminate falsehoods far more easily than people who know better can disseminate the truth.
And from the political science side of the street, you look at people, your fellow citizens, and most political scientists want them to be more engaged. Me, I don't. I think people should live the way they want. And just the very nature of what I said indicates that, okay, the central problem here might be that people who are free to do what they want to do don't want to do what you want them to do. And therein lies the difficulty, right? Most people would rather mow their lawn and wash their car and go bowling and go to the movies than to sit down and dissect various political leanings. They just don't care. And I can't blame them. I mean, I don't care either, and it's my job to care.
And notice something interesting here. I'm with James. I don't blame people because it's not their job to care about these things. I've got more important things to be thinking about. And when we lived in a world like we had at the founding, where the understanding was government existed to protect property rights, to defend your borders, and that's basically it. The concept that we have today of positive rights, if I have a right to healthcare or a right to housing or right to food or whatever it is, that's completely foreign to the founders. And here's the thing. If you live under a government that the founders had in mind, one exclusively based on negative rights, it doesn't matter if your neighbors aren't paying attention to what's going on, because the government's not intruding on your lives. It's when we get to where we are today that all of a sudden everything's a positive right, that the guy down the street can vote for free health care thinking it's a good thing, and that impacts me negatively because A, it's a bad thing, and B, Because of the positive rights regime, he now has the ability to encourage the government to take money out of my pocket to give to him for whatever he wants.
And just backing up for a second, and negative rights are the kinds of rights that the American founding pointed towards. It's very simple. When you look at negative rights, what are we talking about? Well, generally speaking, everything in the First and Second Amendments, we could just use those as quick examples. The right to keep and bear arms, does that cost your fellow citizens anything monetarily? And no. How about the right to the free exercise of religion? Does that cost your fellow citizens anything? And no, of course not. And every single negative right is like this. There is no bill to pay for them. The government is charged with not doing things instead of doing things. Now, when we get to the positive rights regime, that's exactly how it works. The government must act. So previously, the government could not act, and now the government must act. And we get this sea change from about 1909 forward, when the progressive movement kind of hit home in the United States. And before you know it, we have all these laws and rights, and they intersect and they conflict all over the place, and they're incredibly expensive. Your right to a retirement through Social Security. Things like this, right? What we euphemistically call Obamacare. These are very expensive things, and the way they work is we take all of the money that covers these things from one group, and then we dole it out to another group. We've got these two different kinds of rights. And we probably should never have called positive rights rights in the first place, because it confounds the matter. They're not the same kinds of rights as you find in the founding. And this is the confusing place where we find ourselves. Frankly, I understand why people tune right out of this. They have children to raise. They have jobs to do. They don't want to deal with this all day, every day, and I can't say I blame them.
But on the other hand, what happens here is you get decade after decade of this conception of positive rights and the ability for people to encourage the government to take money from one group and give it to another. And a lot of these things sound good and they sound right, that people should have health care, people should have food. And my complaint isn't against that. My complaint is against the fact that once you open that door to the government actively doing things, you end up where we are now with $30 trillion in debt, a Social Security Administration that itself projects will be bankrupt in the next 13 years.
I'm sure you guys have heard this concept that people should have to take a test in order to qualify for their voting rights. I know that offends some people, but it's such a powerful thing, your vote. I think that people should know what they're voting on. And instead, a lot of times it's feelings and emotions. The way I grew up was from the perspective of Democrat good, Republican bad. And it wasn't until I moved out and started my schooling and started meeting people from other communities and other walks of life that I started to question that that's not necessarily a black and white thing.
That's just unwinding now. We're only now seeing blacks going to the Republican Party in anything approaching numbers. All of a sudden, they're a player in Republican politics. They haven't been for well over 100 years, since Reconstruction. But this is something that came up a lot when Ant and I first started working together. Ant's a trained economist, which gives him a different skill set. He's got a different toolbox than I've got. And he would say things like you just did, that we want people to vote and maybe they should be better informed. And how about a test? And my backbone would go straight up, because anything that gets us back to slavery in the Jim Crow South is going to be really, really difficult in the end. The tests for the franchise, that was one way that, especially in the races south, blacks were kept from the franchise. They would just make these tests so difficult that literally no one would pass it. But it was only given to blacks. When I was in graduate school working on my PhD, a professor walked in one night and handed out a slip of paper, and it had a bunch of test questions on it. And she said, "Just answer it, no questions." And it turned out to be one of these tests that blacks were forced to take after the Civil War. And in a room full of doctoral candidates, one person passed it. Look, you have to admit that some of the things are time-bound. Some of the answers were no longer the same. So a lot of people failed because of the difference in time. But boy, you would think a room full of PhD candidates in political science would have been all over that, and they just weren't. So whenever we get something that looks or smells like that, it gets a lot of extra attention. And I don't know how to get around the problem of our own terrible history on this.
I would be happy for a test, not for the American voter, but for Congress.
Damn straight.
If you're going to be a congressman and you're going to vote on a bill,
yes, please.
Let's demonstrate that you've actually read and understood this thing you're going to be voting on.
Oh, and we could make this so much better and so much easier. I remember I was speaking in front of a room, maybe 200-300 people, and somebody at the end asked, well, should we have some kind of test for potential candidates for office? And I said, absolutely, a reading test. I want them to read the entire Constitution of the United States out loud in front of people. So later, when they do all kinds of stupid, we could say, don't you remember that day that you read a longish document? And I would love to see this. The power of the words of the Constitution should be sufficient.
Talk about why the world of economics is so important for everyone. Why is it important for people to understand?
From a selfish perspective, the importance is that if you don't know this stuff, people are going to take advantage of you. And by people, I mean specifically politicians. I had a colleague come in today and told me, actually it's the first that I had heard, that Joe Biden had signed whatever he had to sign to forgive whatever the student loan was. I guess it's $10,000 per student or something. I don't even know the details yet. But this person came in and asked me, why would the president hand out basically checks for giving $10,000 of student loans rather than giving a tax rebate? Or make student loan payments tax deductible, like mortgages are. And I thought about it for a minute, and it occurred to me, even if the numbers came out the same, there's going to be differences because of taxes and this kind of thing, but even if the numbers came out the same, the politicians have an incentive to do it the way they did it. Because who's the primary beneficiary when they forgive the student loan? The primary beneficiary is the student, the young person. The tax deduction, the primary beneficiary there is the parent. And even then, only the parents that are itemizing their taxes. And so all of a sudden, you see what's going on here. They're aiming this legislation at the demographic group they want to capture in the election. And so here comes one of the great lessons of why it's important to understand the economics, because politicians are constantly doing that, aiming their legislation in such a way as to grab you in, even if the legislation is to your detriment. Good case in point here is every time a politician says, let's tax corporations, people cheer and say, yeah, those nasty corporations, they should be paying taxes. The politicians and the corporations both know what's happening here. Whatever tax the politicians put on the corporations, they're going to pass directly on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And so it's actually the people who are doing the cheering are the ones that end up unknowingly paying the tax.
I'm a well-educated man. I have a PhD, and yet I didn't understand economics all that well, and that's why I went and found Anthony. It's not shameful that you don't know something. It's shameful that you don't know something and you do nothing to correct it.
I think there's something even worse than that, James. It seems to be the case more so in economics than anywhere else I've seen, is that people don't know something, and my guess is they may well realize they don't know it, but they claim that they do, and they will double down so hard. Even if an expert comes along and says, no, I don't think you're right about this.
Anthony and I have the two jobs as a political scientist and an economist, that everybody has an opinion on exactly the things that we know about. And they think that their opinion is worth exactly the same as what our opinion is worth. And that makes it very difficult to be effective in the space we work in.
Years ago, I was on an elevator at my university going somewhere, and someone stepped on another faculty member who I knew was in the English department. This person knew I was in economics, turns to me and says, you know the problem in economics? You people need to be teaching Marx. I'm thinking, you have no idea what you're talking about.
That's exactly the thing, because almost every English department in the United States includes Marx on their list of things to read. And when you point out that Marx didn't even write in English, it's a little strange that they think they should import this into their classes. No economist outside of maybe one or two departments in the entire United States would understand Marx to be a serious economic thinker.
Right. He was a philosopher. He wasn't an economist.
He wasn't a good philosopher either.
I don't think you guys talked about deterministic and stochastic relationships in cooperation and coercion. But I think for the audience, because a lot of people don't think about this, I'm just going to talk about this briefly, Anthony. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So this was in one of your, I think you're giving a lecture somewhere. So a deterministic relationship, it's like 100% absolute. So
it's true in every case.
Yeah, sun rises in the east, sets in the west. Stochastic relationships are relationships which are for the most part true, but there are exceptions.
Right. I teach this actually when I teach statistics. And I say to people, look, students have a hard time getting their heads around statistics because statistics are about stochastic relationships. And we're brought up from elementary through high school to think in terms of deterministic relationships. Deterministic relationship is true in every single case. So, 4 is bigger than 3. 4 is always bigger than 3. If you find one example in which 4 is not bigger than 3, you have upended everything we think we understand about mathematics. That's a deterministic relationship. Economics, in fact, all the social sciences, are based on stochastic relationships that are true on average, even though they're not necessarily true in every case. The classic example is when someone says to me, well, what about the minimum wage? And I say, well, raising the minimum wage will cause low-skilled, low-educated workers to become unemployed. And invariably somebody says, no, that's not right, because my Uncle Joe didn't have an education and didn't have much skills, and the minimum wage went up and he didn't lose his job. And I'm saying, no, this is a stochastic statement. It's true on average. It's not necessarily true in every single case. And so when you find your case of Uncle Joe who didn't behave the way that the economists predicted, that's not upending anything in economics. It's simply an outlier. It's an aberration.
Do either of you have thoughts on our modern educational system and how it's failing our young people and ultimately the country?
Ant and I travel around the country and we speak at high schools. And this was something that Ant wanted to do that I thought was going to be a waste of our time. But I agreed to do it. It's been utterly transformative to us in a number of ways. But the weirdest thing that I think I can tell you is that there are good high schools across the country that are doing the job that they're supposed to do. Are they perfect? Well, no, nothing is. But I've been consistently shocked at the very high quality of education that comes from certain places. Now, when people ask me and Anthony or the two of us together to come visit and talk to their students, I think we're getting a selection bias here, right? Only really good teachers would do that in the first place. I don't think that we've got some kind of situation here where everything's wonderful and this sort of thing. But we see examples all over the country, and I mean all over the country, in school districts that are very, very different from one another, that are doing a really impressive job.
We've been to the second poorest county in the country, and we have been to some of the richest counties in the country, their high schools. We go to private schools as well, but these are mostly public schools we're talking about. And we have found, in this case, this poorest high school, the quality of education the students were getting there was on par with the quality of education at the very rich high schools.
Off the charts.
As we look at the many high schools, and we've done now, good Lord, I guess maybe 500 high schools over the years.
Yeah, it's been a lot of them.
Money isn't the issue. It's not a question of rich high school versus poor high school in terms of what's driving quality education. What's driving the quality education are teachers who care. And you can see it when you walk in the classroom. The teacher's engaged, the students are happy to see him, they're coming up, they're asking questions. This is coming from the teacher. Now, you'll hear politicians say things like, well, we need to pay our teachers more. And I always cringe when they say that, because on the one hand, I agree. On the other hand, I don't. And what I mean by that is this. There are some really, really fine quality teachers out there, and they should be paid more. In fact, there are some really fine quality teachers out there who have left teaching because they're not paid enough. But when politicians say we should pay teachers more, they want to pay them across the board. And there are a lot of teachers out there who should not be paid more. In fact, they should be paid less.
And following up on your central observation, the poorest schools, they may not have the physical plant. And once you wash away all of those things that don't actually matter, and you take a look at how teachers interact with young people, it's no surprise that you'll find good teachers everywhere, just like it's no surprise that you'll find bad teachers everywhere. But this is the determining factor. Every place we go with great teachers, those students actually keep up with us for years.
Yeah.
So imagine what they do with the teacher who brought us in.
Let's talk a little bit about cooperation and coercion. What inspired the two of you to write Cooperation and Coercion?
Well, this started off, actually had a different title. It was Don't. And it was going to be a story about all sorts of things the government shouldn't do. I started, before I met James, just collecting stories of instances in which the government attempted to do something and went wrong and why. And I showed this to James and said, let's make a book out of it. And he said, no, this is lousy. You need some theme. This is just a collection of stories. And so we sat down and we thought out, okay, what should a book that's trying to communicate this kind of thing look like? And what we ended up with, Cooperation and Coercion, was a very different animal. James already knew. He brought me to the realization that we're telling a story about how humans organize themselves. And they organize themselves sometimes via cooperative means and sometimes via coercive means. And that both of these things have pluses and minuses. That is, there are some instances in which government is the right tool for the job. Now, I think the number of instances there is very small. It's not zero, but I think it's very small. There are most of the other instances in which cooperation is the appropriate tool for the job. As we wrote this book, we came to the last chapter, and the last chapter wasn't working. We were saying things that were contradicting things that were said earlier in the book, and at least this is the point where I came to the realization that it's not cooperation or coercion. It's cooperation and coercion, that we need both of these things used in the proper ways. That's the recipe for a healthy society.
And I think the book is a good book. I'm proud to have written it. But it was a difficult labor. What we came to realize is that when academics write books for a popular audience, really what they're doing is writing books for an academic audience. And we realized, I don't remember when, but it was somewhere in the middle, that what we needed to do was tell better stories than are usually told. That storytelling is the way people come to understand larger things. And there's no shame in that. We reason by analogy. So we took it on ourselves at that point to be better at telling stories. And I think that's the thing that brought the book to a wider audience. People could open it, and we didn't talk down to them, and we didn't make them feel like they were stupid. We just said, hey, we might know some things that you don't. And the minute we started with that approach, it just opened up a lot of doors. At roughly the same time, we started down the podcast road on that same thought. But I think that's been the key to every success we've had.
In our relationship, you opened my eyes to lots of things that I would not have seen otherwise because I'm an economist. We don't encounter certain things, and so too you, I would imagine.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
As part of our relationship, I've been dealing with simultaneously telling you things I know and listening to things you're telling me that I don't. So I think that attitude just carries over to how we deal with people who listen to our podcast and read our book.
If you understand how little you actually know, and I mean that, none of us knows all that much. Now, I specialize in one thing and Ant another, so we're able to come into focus for each other, but you have to be quite humble. When I was 18 years old, I knew everything. At age 55, somehow I don't know near as much. And yet, I know more. I've been studying for 35 years. As you realize how much is left out there for you, how much that you don't know now and that you probably will never know, you get to be very, very humble. If I could wave a magic wand and have everybody just behave a little differently, I think this is what I would choose.
Our friend James Stacy Taylor, who teaches at the
College of New Jersey,
he's a philosopher, and he says, and I think it's beautiful, he says, look, I'm going to say a bunch of things, and some of them are going to be true and some of them won't be. And I don't know which is which. I rely on you challenging me for me to figure out what I've said that's wrong and what I have said that isn't.
That is really remarkable. Most professors walk into a room thinking, I know everything, let's get this over with. But the best of us, I think, walk in thinking, I'm pretty sure I've got the right answer here, but let's see what happens. There's a big difference between those two things.
Because we can't trust the population to always do the right thing, is some coercion always necessary? But ultimately, is it valuable to have an environment where people can voluntarily cooperate as well?
I'm at heart an anarchist. I love the anarchist position, and I think that ultimately that's where humans will end up. But James has disabused me of many of my Pollyanna-ish views of anarchism by saying, look, there are certain instances in which you've got to use coercion, not the least of which is anarchists like to talk about the importance of property rights. Well, who's going to enforce those property rights? And you can talk about something like private police force, and okay, but it's not just enforcing the property rights, it's defining them, and that's a legislature. And then it's adjudicating disputes about them, and that's a judiciary. And before you know it, your call for property rights itself implies the existence of a government, if only to do those three things, to define, enforce, and adjudicate those property rights.
Yeah, I'm right there with Ant in this line of thinking, although I was never an anarchist, right? That's never been my position. I came to politics through Plato and Aristotle and then filtered through Thomas Jefferson. I'm what's called a minarchist. I think we should have a very small federal apparatus. I'm a little less nasty about it when you think about what state legislatures might do, because, it seems that if you're going to tell people how they must live, you should be pretty close to them, geographically at least, to have everybody understand that you're on the same page somehow. I'm in Tucson, about 90 miles north of Mexico. Our city shares more in common with Mexico than it does with any place in New England. You take a look at the differences we have. New York, Eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, that seems to be a chunk of places that have a lot in common. Does Florida belong with them? Well, not really. And when you take a look at these sorts of observations, I think it's pretty clear that you're going to have a lot of experimentation happening at the state level, and I'm fine with that. That's an issue for the citizens of those various states to deal with. What we all think about the federal government, the first thing should be, okay, it shouldn't do much. But it should always do these few things that it is incredibly well suited to do. You think of things like national defense, border security. These things, whether you want open borders or not, these things are for the federal government alone, not for the various state governments involved. The state governments have many more things, and then you could go all the way down to local statutes and see where even those have quite a lot to do with a person's immediate happiness. But the real goal here is keeping each level of government, federal, state, county, local, in its proper place. And that's a tough thing to do. And I think our history proves that it's so difficult, we might not be able to do it.
And notice here, as much as I complain about things like quote unquote free health care and Social Security and student loan forgiveness and all of that, my complaint primarily is that that's all happening at a federal level. If you want to have free health care, if you want to have Social Security, if you want to forgive student loans, do all of that at the state level. And here's why. Each state has the opportunity to do it differently. The states that do these things well, they'll attract businesses, they'll attract people. States that do it poorly, people and businesses will leave. And all of a sudden, you have the same competitive forces that make industries so great and so consumer-centric. You have those forces unleashed at the political level amongst the states as they try to compete for businesses and people.
And it goes a little further than that too, Ant, because people who live in a state that they think is now going too far, they could pack up their belongings and leave.
Yeah, they can walk away.
And we already see that happening with New England and the Northeast more generally. People, especially people of retirement age, are just leaving, and they're leaving in droves. And where are they going? Mostly to Florida. What does that mean for Florida? Well, a lot of good things for Florida. Well-to-do people who have worked a lifetime to accumulate some money are moving in, and that's going to benefit damn near everybody. Who's leaving from the Northeast, though? And it's in no small part their tax base.
Right.
So what happens? They have confiscatory taxes, people pack their bags and leave, and then they have to have even higher taxes, which of course makes even more people leave. As long as people are free to leave anytime they want, I say have at it. Go for your different state legislative attitudes. Try something new. Do what you think will benefit your population. And if you get it right, people will not be flowing out, they'll be flowing in.
And notice something interesting. Pretty much the same people who understand that monopolies in the private sector are a bad idea because you should have competition, you should have businesses competing for the customers. And people understand that, but many of the same people who will say that will also be in favor of governing more at a federal level. Well, on the political sphere, the federal government is a monopoly. It's a political monopoly. You can't escape it. And so if monopoly is bad in the private sector, it's also bad in the public sector.
Ant and I, during the run-up to the presidential election, through all of those interminable debates, we sat there in rapt attention with little pads, and we're going to cross off the number of times the words debt or deficit were uttered. And after all, and I mean all, after every single thing, all of those debates were closed. We had a grand total of mentions of debt or deficit 0 times. Not once.
Not even by the moderator, let alone the candidates. What that tells us is that the two parties have come to the conclusion that neither one of them can solve this. And so neither one has an incentive to beat the other one over the head with it.
And you might remember Donald Trump, when he was candidate Trump, he said that he was going to wipe out the federal debt inside of 8 years.
At the time, if he had put 100% of tax revenues toward the debt, he couldn't have paid it off in 8 years. He would have to shut down the entire federal government and do nothing but pay off the debt. So there'd be one government employee. That would be the person that writes a check on the debt each year. That's it.
And look at what we have to assume, right? We have to assume that we could do this and that the entire economy wouldn't crash immediately. And that's about where we are on the debt right now. It is literally impossible to pay it off. We ran the numbers on this not too terribly long ago, and it would take, over 100 years of pretty conservative fiscal management.
Yeah, if you include their Social Security obligations, you're dealing with a century-long problem. Congress can't manage to keep its promises for a year, let alone 100 of them.
Where do you all see the United States in 10 to 20 years? Should I set that further? Or, are we in for some big changes in the short term or in the long term? Or what are your predictions?
But I think in the next 15 years, plus or minus, maybe 10, maybe 20, Social Security as we know it is different. I don't think it's going to go away, but it's going to be significantly transformed. And by that, I mean, at the least, workers are going to have to be paying about 20% more in Social Security tax than they're paying now. At the most, we might be seeing things like Social Security redefined so that anyone earning over a certain amount doesn't get it. And we're going to argue about what that amount is. So I think that's one of the things that happens. I think another thing that happens is that the government becomes kind of a permanent player in higher education. Not only in terms of footing the bill, but you're going to see them turn around and Congress is going to say things like, well, look, we're paying for all of this tuition. We should have a say in what you universities are teaching and who you're hiring. And all of a sudden, we're going to become public school 2.0.
As long as the federal government keeps paying $1.25 for every dollar it brings in, we will inexorably be heading towards financial disaster. Can I tell you when? I cannot. But sooner or later, that's going to be the problem that distinguishes us for all time. And people who are smart enough to read the tea leaves, and this includes every member of Congress, even AOC and Bernie Sanders, you know that there will be a collapse somewhere in this system. The real question is how much of a collapse and when. And those two things I can't answer. I just know that we are looking at extraordinarily terrible times. Times that will make our shopping excursions during the COVID pandemic look almost cute by comparison.
I share some serious concern about where we're headed over the next couple of decades. I don't think we end up in a hellscape that you might imagine from what James is describing. I think we end up with, maybe it's 50 years down the road, maybe sooner, a much reduced federal government. A federal government that looks a lot more like what the founders had in mind, and beefed up state governments that look a lot more like countries than they do like states. There's a bit of an economic turmoil that's going to come between here and there. I like James' comparison. I think it might look a lot like COVID. I don't think it's going to look horribly worse than COVID, but I do think it would be protracted. So imagine, the supply chain problems that we had and the people out of work problems that we had. Imagine that over the course of 5-10 years. I think that's what we could be looking at.
And let's be a little more optimistic still. Almost every human being on the face of the planet right now is living a world better than his grandparents did.
Yes, and that's a great thing to remind everybody, James.
If my grandparents could walk through my house, they would be astonished.
Yeah.
My neighbors aren't astonished, right? People we have over for dinner are not astonished. Old people would be, though, every time. All the things we have at our disposal, simply because we want them. It's nothing short of miraculous.
I think we'll take a step down from that, but even a step down from that, it's still going to be a step up from what was considered solidly middle-class living in my parents' time.
I think that's exactly right. That's a very optimistic note to end on, isn't it?
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.